Can I start in? I'm Bill Etchickson, the head of the Brussels office for the European Union of Progressive Judaism. This session is about Jewish demography and whether our numbers are going to allow the Jewish people to continue to thrive in Europe. And the numbers, there's a new study out that shows that the numbers have decreased dramatically. In the 19th century, 88% of the world's Jewish population lived in Europe. Today, it's only 9% of the world's Jewish population resides in Europe, and that includes Britain, Turkey, and Russia. And that's the lowest proportion in more than 800 years. Only 1.3 million people currently living in Europe define themselves as Jews. Now, we're fortunate to have as our guest speaker the author of a new study on this subject of Jewish demography, Sergio Della Pergola. He's Professor Emeritus of Population Studies at Hebrew University, and he's published numerous books and more than 200 papers. And he tells us he's got some new information about progressive Judaism and the numbers, demography of progressive Judaism in Europe to release to us. So Sergio, you were born in Trieste when Italy was under German occupation, and now you've emigrated to, well, a long time ago in 1966 to Israel, and you're speaking to us from Jerusalem, where the internet is not so great, so we hope you can stay with us. Welcome, Sergio. Please explain to us your new study.
Yes, good evening. I'm very distressed. We are having troubles with our internet connection right now, and so there may be interruptions. I'm very sorry, totally unpredicted, and but it will come back. So if I'm out, please continue, and I'll do my best to be back with you. So hello, I am very glad of this occasion to present some overview and also some new findings about the situation of European Jewry. This is based at JPR in London, the Jewish Policy Research Institute, of which I'm also a member, besides being at the Hebrew U. And together with my colleague Daniel Statsky, we did a study which was published recently, and we are now working on a new paper on Jewish identities in Europe. So I think without further ado, I will try to mount my PowerPoint, hoping there aren't too much disturbances in this session. I hope you can see. Can you see it? Do you see it? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So
yes,
the question you asked me was, is there a future for Jews in Europe? And I'm trying to answer. As I mentioned, I deal with demography, but also very much with the values, Jewish identification, the contents. And as I mentioned also, this is the continuation of a study on Jews in Europe at the turn of the millennium. We recently published with Dr. Daniel Statsky at JPR. So you mentioned already a few notions about the number of Jews, and here we have recent data about the total in Europe, the different components of the continent. The bottom line is that in 2020 we had above 1,300,000 Jews, but in 1970 the total from the west to the east was 3,200,000. So that there is a huge difference of nearly 2 million less in Europe. Most of the difference is due to emigration from the former Soviet Union, FSU, which had 1,800,000 Jews, and then it has more than 200,000. It's a remarkable decline of nearly 90%, and that's one of the fundamental reasons of this change. By the way, in the European Union, also the numbers have changed a little bit, but less remarkably so. There is 150,000 Jews less today than 30 years ago. The rest of Europe, including the United Kingdom, that is already accounting for the Brexit, has also lost more than 100,000 of which nearly 100,000 in the UK. Now, some of this, most of this is due to immigration, but there are other troubling trends among European Jewry and in fact also among American Jewry, and it is the very low birth rate and the aging of the population. And so, unfortunately, at some point, there are more deaths than Jewish births, so the population declines. But I would insist the main factor of change has been the huge leaving by many, and this can be explained by political and socioeconomic reasons. And then also looking at the proportion of Jews in Europe, as already mentioned, it is today less than 10%, whereas before the Shoah it was 60%, and after World War II, after the Shoah, it still was more than 1/3 of all of the Jews in the world. It has declined very much since the 1970s, as I mentioned. Another huge transition that has occurred is the passage of the center of gravity from Eastern Europe, which was predominant, in fact, until the 1970s, to Western Europe. Western Europe has been able to incorporate immigrants, some of them from non-European countries, such as the very significant return to Europe from North Africa in connection with the decolonization of the French Empire. And so French Jewry was the main beneficiary of this huge input, and to some extent also other Western countries. But nevertheless, the main thing that has happened is the very big amount of people who have left. Now, all of this needs a digression about who is a Jew, because we just speak of numbers, but we have to specify. And of course, the discussion is not very simple. Let me shortly describe this with a model which provides a global view. It is not only Europe. The figures here reflect the total Jewish population estimates. Shortly, we have a central core in the darker blue, which says we are Jewish, and religion is the variable, the determinant of our attachment to Judaism. Then there is a second circle which says we are Jewish, but without religion. Religion doesn't play a role in our life. But the commonality of these two central circles is that they say we're Jewish and that's it. We're not something else that is exclusively Jewish. This is what I call the core Jewish population. Worldwide, it today approaches 15 millions, including Europe, including Israel, including America. And this is also the numbers, the definition that applies to the numbers that we saw a moment ago. However, particularly in connection with the high rate of intermarriage that has prevailed during the second half of the 20th century, also before, in fact, and continues today, there is a more complex definition of people who are partly Jewish in their own self-definition and partly non-Jewish. They cannot say I'm simply Jewish. They say I have a multiple identity, and they will not withdraw from any of these. And there are other people who are connected to Judaism, although they say I'm definitely not Jewish. I'm not Jewish. I have maybe a Jewish parent, or sometimes even two Jewish parents, but I do not consider myself Jewish. When we take together these, we have, as you can see, the second row from bottom, another about more than 3 million people who, together with the core Jewish population, form what I call the population with Jewish parents, whether Jewish or not Jewish. But we cannot ignore this because, of course, having a strong family connection emotionally and also economically is significant. The next level is what I call the enlarged Jewish population. That is the total of Jews and non-Jews who live together in the same household, the EJP, enlarged. It means it also includes all those members of families like spouses or other members of family who are not Jewish, but they live together. And so together, most extensive definition here is the law of return, that Israeli instrument that allows people to go to Israel, get citizenship and writing and voting rights, and that's another 3 million people. So the difference between the core and the law of return is about 9 million, and this is significant. We cannot simply ignore it. The point is that we should try not to confuse data and try to speak consistently of a given definition, and then compare. For the purpose of my comparisons previously, I compared core data at all points in time. Nonetheless, I insist, from the point of view of policies, from the point of view of Jewish community, also the more peripheral circles are to be taken into account in some way. Now, these distinctions operate very differently all across Europe. Very shortly, you can see that in the European Union of the 27, there is a predominance of the core, and also in other Europe dominated by the United Kingdom. But in the former Soviet Union, the core only forms about 1/4 of the total, and the majority of people who are relevant for discourse in one way or another.
I hope Sergio, you back, Sergio? Let's get him. He was having trouble with his internet. It persists, well. Well, let me, since we've lost Sergio, let me introduce the other two panelists, and if Sergio comes back, he'll come in and you can start reacting to already what he's shown. Leslie Bergman, Leslie, we have to, yep, you have to step up. Okay, Sergio, are you back?
I truly apologize, but this is, it doesn't happen. I mean, tonight we have, maybe because of weather, maybe because of the elections, we have trouble. So please be patient. So let me go back. By the way, the PowerPoint seems to have disappeared. So I'll try to locate it again. And if you stay with me patiently, I was saying that there are different ways of manifesting your Jewishness. I will try to be very concise. It can be religion, it can be ethnicity, it can be parentage or other heritage and culture. You have a huge difference across Europe in terms of the importance attributed by Jews to religion. The UK is the one with the highest percentage, followed by Italy, Spain, Austria, then Belgium, but in especially Northern and Eastern European countries, most of the Jews do not think of religion, they think of ethnicity. They also think maybe of culture. It is an attachment which is much more secular, or simply the result of parentage and family genealogy without the specific contents attached to it. Now, I would like to point to some very interesting changes, pointing to really literally some transformation in, at least in some sections of European Jewry. This diagram is interesting because it shows the difference between those in our sample. Incidentally, I'm talking of a European sample of 16,000 persons who answered an investigation on anti-Semitism as such, in terms of the anti-Semitism variable, in the framework of the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency. A certain number of people say, I was not Jewish, or I was not conscious of being Jewish when I was raised as a child, but now I am. And so in our sample, this includes the whole sample. You see in the blue, the proportion of those who said, I didn't think of myself as a Jew when I was a child. And then in red, the proportion who still have some doubts about their Jewishness, their own perception of their being Jewish. And so as you see, this percentage has diminished very strongly between childhood and now. It means there is a return to Judaism. Many people who were not aware or did not want to be or were outside, they now think they are inside. I'm not talking now of formal conversion. I'm just talking of self-identification. And this diagram points definitely to a return to the center in terms of what is happening, what has happened recently among European Jews. Another factor which in a sense goes in the same direction compares the proportion intermarried among Jews above age 50 and below age 50. To the right, the older, and to the left, the younger, in the 12 countries considered here. Now, if you compare the percentages, you will find that in most cases, the younger are less intermarried than the older. You see the signs minus, plus, plus, minus, minus. There are only 3 countries, Sweden, Denmark, and Italy, where the younger cohort has higher percentages of intermarriage than the older one. It means, in a sense, a process of, I repeat myself, returning to the center of the community, returning to a more compact concept of a Jewish constituency. So these are interesting signs of a pendulum that moves in the direction of a stronger Jewish identity, which contradicts the theory and also the empirical experience that we have had for many years, pointing to assimilation, dissociation, lack of interest, drifting out. I think the pendulum has reversed its tendency. I will discuss some of the reasons in a few moments. Now to the denominations, and this is really very new in terms of Europe. At the moment, I present the data for the total of Europe and not for the different countries. We have the percentages of our sample who identify with different modes of being Jewish. And so going clockwise, about 5%, we are talking of the adults, of course, 5% say Haredi, that is extremely Orthodox, somewhat segregated Jewish communities. 8% say Orthodox, 24% say traditional, which may be, in a sense, perceiving yourself as part of the community. Then about 15% find themselves 15% find themselves Reform progressive. Again, I'm not talking of affiliations. I'm talking of self-perceptions of our sample. 38%, which is the largest single group, say just Jewish. That is no preference for any particular stream. 5% say I am of mixed parentage, and myself, I consider myself kind of partly Jewish, and 6% say none of this, which probably means being even more peripheral in terms of the typology. But what we can see here for the first time is the relative proportion of the more strongly identified sections of the community. And again, it doesn't reflect exactly affiliation, it reflects the persuasions and the propensities. Now, again, when we compare childhood with now, we have very interesting changes in terms of what was that propensity when you think of yourself as a child and when you think as yourself now. Haredi, for example, has a slight increase. Slightly more today think of themselves as Haredim than when they were children. The same can be said about Orthodox. The difference is minor. Then traditional, on the other hand, there is a decline, and the decline is partly explained by the significant increase in those who say, I prefer the Reform progressive orientation now vis-a-vis what I might have thought or maybe my parents thought when I was a child. So we have a passage from 10% childhood and 15% now. The truth is that there is a big chunk of European Jewry who say just Jewish, and it is significantly bigger among those now vis-a-vis a childhood, which means there has been a certain passage of a kind to lesser definition. But this passage is explained, in a sense, by the significant diminution of those who were really very peripheral, the mixed who have diminished. None of these, which is also a way of not being able to define yourself Jewishly, which also have diminished. And then those who were non-Jewish, who by definition in this survey, they must be Jewish because this was a survey of Jews. And therefore, anyone who was included had to be some kind, at least partly, of self-definition as a Jew. So you see, in a sense, where people come from and when they go. Now, this is an interesting additional piece of information. Where do those who were non-zero Jews and have chosen to become now more Jewish, the particular group that was totally out, and now the choices they have made. And here we see that 1% of those who were totally out say I'm Haredi, 6% Dati, Orthodox, 13% traditional, 27% Reform Progressive, and 52% just Jewish. So you see that coming from the cold, if I can say so, and coming to a warmer Jewish environment delineates preferences which are quite articulated. In terms of the specifically Reform Progressive movement, this is quite a benefit. It is about more than one out of 4 of those who were nothing, and now they choose to be expressively Jewish. A further point, which is of great interest, is the ability of each of the extreme denominations to keep inside those they had, and on the other hand, to acquire new people. Here with we learn 2 processes which are in a sense complementary, but they are different. Let's look at the different denominations to understand what happens. The Haredim has a very high rate of retention. It means relatively few of those who were Haredim at childhood have stopped being Haredim and have made a different choice. More than 80% of the childhood Haredim are still Haredim. On the other hand, the proportion of those who were not Haredim and have now chosen to become Haredi is relatively small. Among the Orthodox, the proportion of retention is about 60%. Likewise, the traditional and also the Reform Progressive. That is, if we take the initial block of people, about 60% have remained inside. But what is very different is the propensity to join. And as you see, the Orthodox have kept about 60% and have also been able to enlist a new bunch of 60% of new people. And so in fact, they have grown. The traditional have kept 60%, but they have enrolled only 20. And so they have lost significantly. The Reform Progressive have kept about 60%, but the enrollment of new people is the equivalent of more than 90% of the number they had initially. So this shows a very significant capability and ability to attract new people from mostly from the more peripheral areas, but to some extent also from the kind of strongly committed areas that appear to the left. And then you have also those who were just Jewish and those who were mixed of none of these. They have lost most of them because most of them have moved to something stronger, and that something stronger prominently illustrate the role of the Reform Progressive trend to attract new people we are talking of a sample, of course, of European Jews. Whoever is left out, we cannot comment much about that, but it points to the very different resilience of the different movements and streams in this game. Now, let me make an additional comment. When we take several data and we try to see what's the internal coherence of the data, we can create a sort of map of the distance and of the proximity, of the correlation and of the irrelevance of certain aspects of Judaism vis-a-vis other aspects. This is a technique of mapping which is based on the correlations between different modes of being Jewish. We have here in clockwise order from upper left an interest in Jewish culture as an important component of my being Jewish. Then the example of festivals and family, and then believing in God, and then giving to charity, being a volunteer in Jewish organizations, and then remembering the Holocaust and fighting against anti-Semitism. These are different modes. Of course, each is an option, and most people do like all of the options, not all of them though. And in the end, another question is, what is more central in this kind of perception of the different options? And we discover, and this was not obvious to us, but we discover that there are two options. One is caring for Israel, and one is feeling belonging to the Jewish people. And by the way, these two options appear very related, the one to the other, and at the center of the concern. That is, there are people who are very much concerned with culture, but very little with God. But both them, both one group and another group, they may both be interested in Israel and peoplehood. It means that Israel and peoplehood do constitute a central concern. By the way, I'm not meaning that this means unreserved support for whatever Israel does. It means that Israel is not, I'm not indifferent to what happens. It is central to my perception, and I'm concerned. I would like things to go for the better. Now, this, in my view, having the experience of previous research, is strengthening of the alien. I'm talking of the salience of these two variables, Israel and peoplehood. And I maintain that some of this is caused by the negative pressures that operate, unfortunately, around us in terms of anti-Semitism, hostility, negationism. Negationism, of course, can be articulated in terms of the refusal to allow Jews equality and equal civil rights and respect. The other thing is denial of the Holocaust, but more importantly and more subtly recently, denial of the right of the Jews to have a specific memory of the Holocaust and not to dilute the Holocaust together with other tragedies, or even as it has been suggested these days, 27th of January was European Day of Memory. Someone has suggested that Day of Memory is not devoted only to the Holocaust and Shoah, but also to all tragedies, including COVID-19. And this, of course, is in a sense a transformation of the actual meaning of what the Day of Memory was supposed to be. And finally, of course, the demonization of the State of Israel, which is very disturbing to many. I repeat and insist, notwithstanding the right of criticism that exists vis-a-vis specific governments of specific actions and specific situations that involve Israel. So I'm maintaining that the negatives are among those who have produced a strengthening of the Jewish feeling and the strengthening of the internal solidarity within this community. One more factor interesting is the amount of interest and attachment of Jews to the European Union. The data here show in blue the percentage of Jews who said they feel strongly attached to the European Union, and in red, those who say in the general population the same. You can see that there are a number of countries, especially in Central Eastern Europe, such as Hungary, Poland, Austria, but also Italy in the south, where the proportion of Jews attached to the European Union is significantly higher than among the total population. That is, Jews feel more Europeans than those nationals. In all of the other countries, Jews also have a higher attachment to Europe, although the difference here is modest and moderate, but nonetheless, it is there. By the way, for those who are interested, specifically in the UK, they will find that the UK did not have the lowest level of attachment to the European Union among all European countries. And that was true also among the Jews, but now Brexit is a fact. And so that's, in a sense, history. And finally, I will conclude with this very short reflection. In terms of what's the future, of course, the slogan is where Europe goes, the Jews will go. That's a slogan, but there is a grain of truth, because we have strong evidence, which I've not produced tonight, that Jewish population distribution reflects very strongly socioeconomic development in the different countries, and even in the different areas of a given country. That is, Jews are very sensitive to the opportunities of education, of labor that exist, and so they tend to concentrate in certain places which are the leading centers in terms of research, production, the sophistication of the labor market. There they can display the advantage of their higher education and other skills. In turn, development tends to be related to greater democracy, tolerance, and pluralism. And of course, if we think of the difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe in the past, to some extent also and now, there is no doubt that there is greater options in the Western societies, and therefore they are more attractive for the development of free and functioning Jewish communities. On the other hand, underdevelopment economically and lack of democracy stand strongly behind emigration. And we have commented in the beginning that huge numbers of Jews have left those areas where there was dictatorship and totalitarianism. They have moved elsewhere, many of them to Israel, but also many of them to the West, including Western European locations. Anti-Semitism, unquestionably, is also a factor of erosion, and it has operated as a factor for immigration. But in very deeper studies that we have conducted, we reached the conclusion that the socioeconomic and political factors in general are much more powerful than anti-Semitism in determining the willingness to leave among European Jews and also among others. And therefore, my concluding remark is that we are not prophets. It's very difficult to say really what's bound to be. The future of the European Union will largely affect the future of the Jews. The problem is that it's very difficult to say at the moment where the future of the European Union lies. Is it going to really realize that dream of a very large power integrated with a lot of circulation of people, of ideas, of goods, services, tolerance, diversity, and acceptance? Or is it going toward a chain of smaller societies, very nationalist and very close, the ones to the others? And so these two scenarios will certainly affect crucially what many Jews will decide to do in the future generation. So I thank you again. I regret the quality of the internet tonight, but I hope you could follow me.
We did, at least I did, Sergio, very much so. And you only cut out once, and please stay with us, because I think we're really privileged to have had this sort of original take on European Jewry. It's the first time I've heard a lot of these figures, and I appreciate. We do have some questions coming in. One was, and then we'll get to the panelists, Sergio, was from Jean-Francois Levy, and please put your questions in the chat box. About France, and specifically, and Pauline perhaps can pick up on that afterwards, that France doesn't count officially people's religion. So how do we know the figures there? How do we deal with that? Maybe Pauline afterwards.
The data I displayed tonight are, I mean, the qualitative data are taken from a big sample that reached thousands of people in France. The sample was a random sample, although there is some bias in the sense that the link to the internet was distributed through all the major Jewish organizations, through the Jewish press. In other words, through instruments and networks which are supposedly Jewish. So to get access to the survey, you had to have some, at least minimum, contact with the Jewish community. If you're totally cut off, it was difficult to get the questionnaire and therefore to answer. However, I must say that we have the data also by affiliation. And we find that quite a substantial proportion of those who answered are not affiliated. That is, the less active strata or circles of French Jewry are represented in the survey. And so they contribute to the total picture for Europe. Of course, we will be pleased later to publish separate data for each of the major communities. Then we will be also able to see the differences, which I've shortly outlined at some point between France, UK, Germany, Hungary, Italy, and the like. But I would say that in terms of the materials that I presented, there is some tendency to over-represent those who are more committed and more interested. In terms of the total numbers, the technique is different. It is based on a study which tries to assess, first of all, the numbers in the longer term. I was discussing, reminding with Pauline, a great friend, a great investigator, Professor Doris Ben-Simon Donat of good memory, with whom in the 1970s we did a massive work of studying French Jewry, starting really from nothing, because the proportion affiliated at that time was quite low. So what we did was literally to search throughout France. We went to the voter list, the voting lists, and we selected people by their names. We did not only select Jewish names, we also selected non-Jewish names to give the opportunity to those who have non-Jewish surnames and are Jewish to be sampled. And so, at least for those who were French citizens, we had a representative sample of all. And then with additional networks, we surveyed those who were not French citizens, but were members of any Jewish organization. It's true that nothing is perfect. So those who were non-citizens and non-members, which probably were at that time, I think we missed something like 2-3% of the total. We didn't have access to that. Then in the following, we have yearly data on immigration to Israel and on immigration from Israel, and estimates on French Jews in Canada, in the US, and in other countries. And we also have estimates about the number of births and the age composition. And so we try to do our best in monitoring the changes. Again, I am the first to concede that there is a margin of error. But when we say that today less than 500,000 Jews are left in France, Jews in the core definition, if we take the law of return definition, of course, the number is higher. I think we are not off the mark. The number have certainly diminished by even something in the range of 100,000, maybe somewhat less, maybe 80,000 vis-a-vis the period when with the late Doris Ben-Simon we were in the field. And then I'd like to remind another name, another good friend and colleague, Professor Eric Cohen, also Zichrono Livracha, who also did 2 studies and published several books on French Jewry. So by looking at the sequence of these studies, I think we get a sense of what's happening. And France has lost a lot of Jews because they have moved elsewhere. There are many in Israel and many are in other countries. The reasons being fundamentally, I think, what I have outlined. certain sense of, in French, they call it malaise, feeling of uneasiness because of the pressures, because of the dangers. There has been terrorism, there have been economic reasons, anti-Semitism, and of course the attraction of other countries who may offer better conditions.
Thanks, Sergio. Since we're talking about France, why don't we go to Pauline? Pauline, you're France's first ever female rabbi. We go way back 30 years when we were starting the synagogue. You were starting our synagogue then. You studied at Leo Baeck College in London, and then you returned to Paris. And your academic research has focused on the history of Jewish conversion, or as you like to say, Jewish proselytism. And you founded the Community Juif Libéral de l'Île-de-France. So since we're talking about France, conversion, what is the impact of that?
Well, first, I want to say thank you, Professor Pergola, for this beautiful presentation, and say, like you, that I'm not a prophet, and I'm also not a sociologist. I'm just a rabbi. So it's very difficult to comment figures, and the attitude to numbers has always been to be very careful, as you are. That is to say that we would like numbers to be perfect, but they are never perfect. And even in the Hebrew language, it's a very small change of vowels between mispar and sipur, for example, or lispor and lesaper, which is to count and recount. And so I was very touched by the fact that you said that.
May I interrupt you?
Of course.
There is another joke. You know, seker is a survey, sheker is a lie.
Right. So it's I think that it's always very moving to see that a great scientist like you can say, you know, we can make mistakes, and indeed when we see the history of the Jewish people, we realize that the history of the Jewish people is actually defying numbers, and it's in the Bible. To say that we will be as numerous as the sand of the sea or the stars in the sky is, for me, a proof of the biblical humor, because we have always been a tiny people. And yet, what is amazing as well is that in numbers we are tiny. I think less than 0.24, am I right, percent of the entire human population. And yet, if you look at the media, we talk about us much too much. And maybe the influence we have is actually much greater than the numbers. And I want also to say, again, as a rabbi, that the dispute, to remember the dispute between Rashi and Rashbam in the Middle Age, and I quote Rashi also because he's from France, but not only, like the main commentator of the Torah and the Talmud. There is a dispute between him and his grandson Rashbam, and because there are many counts in the Bible, as you know, of the people of Israel, and they ask, why do we count? And the answer of the grandfather and the grandson is not the same. The grandfather says we count because we love the Jewish people, like God loves us. So counting is a proof of love, like a teacher would count their pupils to make sure that no one disappears. And then Rashbam says, no, we count because of strategy. So I think it's very interesting, because although there's a dispute between love and strategy, I think one doesn't outrule the other. We can have love and strategy and love, and I'm sure the reason also you do these studies is to help the Jewish people and to bring an insight to what should we do. So I think we of course are enlightened by these numbers, and yet we have also experienced that sometimes different. In what you said about the division between the different tendencies, I had a question, because people in the world are talking now about post-denominational. That is to say that Jews don't want to be identified as belonging to Reform or Orthodox or traditional. So, and they don't want to have these labels. So I was wondering if that was also included in your research. The second question I had also for you is, I know in France there is not a culture of affiliation. That is to say, people don't want to belong to congregation. And having lived in Israel and also in England, I saw in England, maybe because of the cultural background, which is Protestant, you belong to a church or a synagogue or a religious organization. In France, people often don't want to say they belong, and they prefer to say they are independent. And in Israel, I think it's a bit like in France, the Israelis don't want to belong to congregation. So the denomination and the perception also might change the figures. And I always joke and I say my synagogue is full of atheists who come to services. And that also is a question. In France, a lot of people belong to synagogue, but they are not necessarily, they won't say they are religious because of the history of being anti-clerical. And yes, yet they are happy to be in the synagogue. So those were my remarks for a start.
Thank you. There were slight interruptions, but I got you. So I think the post-denominational we catch with that label just Jewish. That is, people, let's understand the data I presented are free expressions given freely and spontaneously by people who participated in a very large study of anti-Semitism. It was not a study of religion. And I think this is very important because had it been a study of religion, maybe some would have been somewhat rejected or suspicious what they want from us. Do they want something ideological? However, anti-Semitism, I think, is a cross-sectional, transversal feature, which in one way or another is understood by many, of course, in different ways, but it's very difficult to be totally alien, totally indifferent. People may say it's a very grave, a very dangerous. People may say, no, it's not. And by the way, my colleagues, I have many friends and colleagues who are scholars of political science in France, and I hear very different ideas about the danger and the influence of anti-Semitism in France. But nevertheless, I don't think anyone can be totally indifferent. And therefore, as I mentioned before, we got participation in this big survey, including many thousands in France, by people who are very different in their personal orientations. And so this gives me trust that we catch the diversity. And I think our data confirm that there is a very big difference between defining yourself one way and being a member of something that, in a sense, would like to reflect that way, you see. I say that about religiosity, but I said that also about, in particular, the reform, progressive liberal tendency, which I think in our data emerges somewhat stronger than in the real numbers of those who are members. I think we get more in the sense they say, if I would have to choose an affiliation, the affiliation I would choose would be of that way, which is being progressive, liberal, and reform. So in a sense, I think our data, again, of course, are not perfect, but they quite faithfully represent the complexity of the situation. And then when you compare, as I tried to do, 2 points in time, that is what was when you were younger or even a child, and what is now, and then you compare different countries, you get a dynamic view of what's happening. And I think the bottom line is that the concern, the interest, the relevance, and the word I like quoting Professor Simon Harman, the salience of something which is Jewish has increased. It has increased in different ways. And the point, of course, from here, and I like very much your quotations of love versus strategy. Love is not easy, but we can understand. Strategy requires an understanding which, unfortunately, I allow myself to be a little critical. We don't see always. We don't see always in our institutions. We don't see, in my view, in our organized frameworks, a sufficient understanding of the complexity of world Jewry and of European Jewry, and then for that matter of Jewry in each country. I think the people move more rapidly than the institutions. And so there is a certain gap between the needs and the solutions proposed. The interesting fact is that people ask for Judaism, maybe for different types of Judaism, but they do want, people are in search for culture. Many of them, of course, can do that through the social networks, which can be a benediction if they are used the right way. You can learn a lot. It can be also, of course, a curse because of the dramatic hate and hatred that is disseminated through the networks, the internet, the social media, and so on. But looking at the positive aspect, I think there is really a market for more. And therefore, the important thing is to be able to provide that.
So we do have a bunch of questions, Sergio, and then Leslie, I haven't forgotten you, but let's ask some of the questions that are coming in from around the world. One from me would be, does conversion play? Have you studied conversion, and does that play an important role in European Jewry? Two, we have a question from Charlotte about Haredi Jews. Their numbers have grown much larger in Israel. Will that happen in Europe because of their high birth rate? From our global president, Sergio Bergman, from Argentina, there's a question about whether we should consider Eastern Europe as part of the larger Soviet collapse story, and is it for the same reasons that we've seen a dramatic decline and go to the West, Western Europe? And from Joseph Konvitz, we have a question about if Jews are decreasing in numbers in France, why is the kosher business booming? I don't know if you can answer that one, but we'll see. So if you could do that, and then we'll let Leslie.
Oh, well, look, I can start from the last, in a sense, the easiest, because it says, in spite of the fact there may be fewer people, but those few people are more interested. So I think it's consistent with the main argument of this conversation, and greater consciousness, greater willingness to do things, and to show things and to transmit things. So I think it's perfectly consistent with what I'm saying. Now, conversion, of course, is a critically difficult topic. I will not deny that I have written rather critical remarks in terms of the policies followed by the Central Rabbinate in Israel. And we must say that the Central Rabbinate in Israel projects a very powerful influence all over the diaspora. Of course, not everybody follows, but it has an influence which is not negligible. First of all, inside the Orthodox Rabbinate, the Orthodox Rabbinate has a certain margin of action just based on Jewish sources. And I know what I'm talking about. I know that you can find a source and then you can give a certain response or another based on other sources, but also based on your understanding of the situation within the Orthodox framework. The Israeli rabbinate has been choosing a line which is extremely limited. And I'll give you just a figure because, as you may know, there is in Israel, precisely because of the law of return, which I mentioned as a broadest framework for defining the strategy of migration. There are about 500,000 persons who came to Israel in the framework of the law of return, but they are not Jewish from the point of view of the Orthodox halacha. Many of them have a Jewish father. Many of them, as always, consider themselves Jewish from all points of view. Many of them have been exposed to anti-Semitism because their name is Levi, Cohen, Abramovich, and everybody thought they were Jewish, although their mother wasn't. And so they say, we would like to be standard Jews in Israel, let us get in. We talk of hundreds of thousands of people, and we see that the rabbinate converts every year, maybe 2,000 or 3,000. Many of them, by the way, are Jews from Ethiopia, and very few are Jews from other countries of the world. So there is a huge line of people who would like to simply become Jewish, but they're not allowed by very stringent methodology preferred in Jerusalem. What is the result of this? Sufferance, estrangement, feeling of foreignness. Some people may even decide to move away from Israel because they cannot find their home in the Jewish state. So you see what has been finally the product of this. So that's, in my view, a big mistake in terms of the strategy of the national state of the Jews, which should be open. And in fact, the law of return says a conversion is a conversion, regardless of who did it, provided it was done in a recognized community. This is the gist of it. Now, anything can be, I mean, not anything, but many types of different communities are recognized communities. So a conversion should be recognized. But the rabbinate then opposes that. It has gone to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court quite wisely has said that we shall not take the decision because this is a political decision that has to be taken in the Knesset. And so the question is still open. And so the question is adjudicated case by case in a way which is fundamentally not doing justice. I'm sorry to say this. I'm a faithful and loyal Israeli, but I'm very disappointed by this. It causes damage. It causes distress. Now, of course, the Haredi population is growing thanks to its higher birth rate, and this is true in Israel. It has, unfortunately, I don't know how much you follow the TV these days. We have a very deep strife in connected with Corona and discipline or lack of discipline. Down into two parts because of this. But more in general, we have visible growth in Haredi communities in the UK, in Belgium, in Antwerp, but also in a place which is relatively less known, and that's Vienna in Austria. So there are certain places where, in fact, the Haredi community has grown, and this has caused, among other things, in smaller communities, stoppage of the decline of Jewish population. I'm speaking specifically about Austria, about which me and Dr. Stetsky wrote a big report recently, which has demonstrated that population decline has stopped, and now there is some population increase, and that's mostly related to that. So you see that these changes are possible. In theory, it's possible everywhere. By the way, France is a relatively traditional community, along with being one of the most secular communities. You know well, of course, that France is a very diverse community, and so that's what causes finally a change in the internal composition of European Jewry. And finally, the question about the Soviet Union. Of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which we saw, generated a series of political changes. It was among the causes of totally opening the doors, which were totally closed, because it was not possible to keep any more that pressure inside. And so it shows once again that there is a very powerful correlation between major changes in political history and the fate of the Jews. With all due respect to the self-determination of the Jews and the fact there are Jewish values which are unique, but very much of Jewish history, including major migration movements, are simply related to geopolitical changes which are totally not in the hands of the Jews. The collapse of the Soviet Union has moved maybe 2 million of Jews away from the Soviet Union. On the other hand, we know well the end of the French Empire generated the huge repatriation of many from North Africa. And previously, I will also say this, which is maybe less conventional, the end of the British Empire is the reason why the state of Israel could be born, because the British were no more capable of holding their empire, and so they have to give independence to India, to Israel, and to many other countries, which is quite significant to us.
Okay, thank you very much. Leslie, let me introduce you. You're Leslie Bergman. You're our the EUPJ's honorary life president, and you've held senior positions in various progressive Jewish organizations, including in South Africa, the EUPJ, and the World Union. You're living now in London, where you had a career as a management consultant, and I think the floor is yours to pose some questions and conclude. I take over to you, Leslie.
Right. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Professor Della Pergola, for another fascinating presentation. I was in the audience when you made your presentation on demographic trends in worldwide Jewry to a conference of the World Union of Progressive Judaism in Jerusalem in 2013. And I remembered raising my hand from the floor and discussing this question of the disturbing sign of the decrease in the percentage population of world Jewry attributed to Europe, saying that certainly there's a responsibility of Jewish leadership to halt this decline. It's not only the 614th commandment not to give history a Hitler posthumous victory, but also a Jewry bereft of the influence of European Jewry would be a much weaker, a less rich type of Jewry. Now, Professor Pergola has presented some fascinating data, which he tells us before the start of this webinar had not been seen before, on these trends, which indicated the importance of Jewish identification as opposed to Jewish formal belonging to different parts of the Jewish stream. And I want to make comments in two directions. Firstly, from the point of view of our own movement in Europe, the 17 countries in which we operate, if I take the period since Professor Pergola presented his presentation 8 years ago and reflect on those 8 years. 8 years is 8 years, 8 years is not 80 years. What's 8 years in the life of the Jewish people? But our own movement has not declined, quite the contrary, in terms of formal affiliation, in terms of countries, number of congregations, people. It has been increasing, some countries significantly, such as Poland, such as other Eastern European countries, such as Italy, such as Spain. Other countries have seen modest growth. No country I know of has shown any form of decline. The most important issue is the one that Professor Pergola raises, and that is the issue of identification. And that is the activities of our communities have become expanded much more. They've become more vibrant. They've extended far broader into the general Jewish community. And this trend towards a more vibrant Jewish community is not only one that you see in our particular stream of Judaism. I observe it throughout Europe, and that is to say, any observer looking at European Jewry today, its manifestations of being Jewish, would have to conclude that it is more vibrant, that there are more evident signs of a renewal of Jewish life, than there were 5 years ago and 10 years ago, even if the percentage of Jews who are classed as Jewish, according to the very fascinating range of identifications given by Professor Pergola, is variable. There is a vibrant Judaism in Europe. Now, what are the reasons for this? In my view, there's one trend which has become very obvious throughout the Jewish world, and that is that communities, and particularly synagogues, used to be associated with going to services. The function of the synagogue was to seat people for services. There is a massive trend across Jewry worldwide to say the function of synagogues should be the original functions as envisaged in biblical times, a Beit HaKnesset, where Jews get together. And this evidence of communities extending their reach into a broader range of activities beyond formal prayer on the few occasions that Jews to get together on Shabbat and festivals is a manifestation of the vibrancy of Judaism as we see in Europe today, and it is fully in accordance with the data which until an hour ago I had not seen from Professor Pergola, which is the sense of Jewish belonging, sense of identification increasing, which tends to favor our movement, which it's much more outreaching and liberal and broader tent viewpoint of Judaism. The second point I want to make, which is one that is not addressed, and that is the issue of philo-Semitism. Philo-Semitism is viewed cynically by most Jews as a manipulative attempt to to be good to the Jews. We love you, Jews, but in the end, all we want to do is convert you or eliminate your Jewish identity from the map. I believe there is a less cynical view, more of a half glass view, of a glass half full view, and that is two things. One is that many countries in Europe have gone beyond the stage of repenting for their complicity or involvement in the Shoah towards saying that they wish to recapture their Jewish, the part of them that was Jewish. Not because we love the Jews, but we understand that with the increasing generational change in Europe, we want to be a more inclusive society and respect and indeed take advantage of those parts of our history which have been eliminated for whatever reasons. This you see in particularly the Iberian Peninsula tonight, but you see it in other parts as well. And secondly, the younger generation, if you read about the value systems, and I'm involved in another area of this to do with diversity, inclusion, nothing to do particularly with Jews, of the values of Generation Z, they don't like being boxed. They don't like excluding people. They don't like labeling people. So we're dealing with a changed generational scenario in Europe, which favors Jews who want to identify as Jews, but be part of a much more inclusive society. So in summary, the data, the 9% may seem depressing at first, but the manifestations of life and Jewish life in Europe are extremely positive. And in my view, from a point of view of somebody who visits European countries, not only from looking at our own organizations, but looking more broadly at what's going on, is positive. And I think that is good for Europe, and I think it's good for world Judaism, that part of Judaism which was forged in two millennia as the critical component of Judaism in its various streams is not going to disappear. It's going to stay. It may not be part of the bipolar axis of America and Israel, but it's there as a vibrant European Jewish Jewry. And I'm extremely happy that this is happening. And we in the leadership of the progressive movement, but I think if we speak to Jewish leaders generally in Europe, would take a glass half full approach.
That gives me the theme for what I'll write eventually on this seminar, because I think it's insightful. We're coming towards the end. There was some final questions, and I'd like to have Pauline and Sergio be able to make some final statements. And from Giorgio, I guess, We have a question about the European Union. I think it's that the values of pluralism, minority rights are crucial to the future of European Jewry. I think it's more of a statement than a question. And I think we all agree with that. And Professor Della Pergola already stated the importance, the fact that more Jews are more positive about the EU than the general population in most of Europe. And then a question from Howard and Christian for you, Pauline, about they understand what you mean about Rambam's comment about strategy means in connection with counting, but strategy about or for what is the question. Over to you, Pauline, for that question and maybe some comments since we saw you writing some notes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, just a comment on the European Union. Of course, we understand why Jews would be for European Union, and I do hope also that there will be more visibility and working together in Europe, and I think it's very important. And at the same time, it's interesting that the pandemia, the actual pandemia, you see people closing their borders and ordering some vaccine for their own population and not for the others. And so it's worrying to see those two opposite trends, but it's just maybe a comment or a question. So probably we have to fight more for the idea of working together. The other comment I had, I completely agree with Leslie Bergman about the hope and the fact that communities are also places to meet. Also a problem with the pandemic because we want people to gather together and it's not often possible, at least these days. So we have to reinvent ourselves. And also a new function, also what I see actually in France is that people not only want to gather together, but they want to learn more. And so that would also go towards what Professor Pergola said, is that we might have fewer Jews, which is not my experience because we are flourishing progressive communities. And in France in the years 70, there was only one, Copernic. Now there are more than 15 in the country. But there is a real desire to learn more, and so to give deeper meaning to their Jewishness, which is what you mentioned earlier. So the Beit HaMidrash tendency is really growing. Many groups in France are gathering to study together Chevrutot, and also last year here we started a new rabbinical school to train leaders for tomorrow, which means, and they already have a stage in all the communities, so and we need more. So this is also a reason to hope. And then a final comment about the question I never answered, Bill, about conversion. In studying the history of conversion, we can see that actually an important number of new Jews helps the Jewish people survive. And many historians say that actually it's thanks to conversion that the Jewish people is still here today. Probably not only, but there is a mythical idea that we have to keep, not to intermarry, not to integrate people from outside because we are fearing that we are losing our identity. But actually, I really believe it's the contrary, and that they were always conversions from the time of the Bible to today, even at times where rabbis were risking their lives to do that, especially in the Middle Ages. So it's interesting to see this trend, and just let us remember Moses, who married Zipporah, who was not of Hebrew origin, and that's probably the best example. And I will just finish with quoting Edmond Flegg, who was a French writer who started the youth movement in France. And he said, I am a Jew because everywhere there's a tendency to despair, the Jews are hoping. So let's hope together.
sorry, Sergio, any final words? Ah, now you're freezing and you're on mute. I'll go while we wait for Sergio's final words, but Leslie, anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, I think I've said my bit. I think that the numbers, the data presented by Professor Pergola are supportive of everything we see empirically, everything we observe, not only in the progressive movement, but in European Jewry throughout Europe. And I would make one point that if you had to go back to any webinar, we weren't doing many webinars 5 years ago, but any conference of Jews or whatever, the subject of anti-Semitism in Europe would have loomed large. It was the fear that the anti-Semitism that we thought had gone back, had disappeared, and be finally quenched after the Shoah had reared its head again. Of course, this is all, in my view, mirrors. Anti-Semitism is with us. It will always be with us. The question is how we manage it. But anti-Semitism, as Professor Pergola has pointed out in his numbers, has really not had the dire consequences that were predicted, including by many Jewish leaders in Israel, in the diaspora, in the last few years in Europe. It's been managed. And in my view, in parallel, we've seen a form of philo-Semitism, which is an environmental support from institutions, from governments, from the broader community as a whole, which we should not, in my view, be cynical about. We should accept it what it is, and that is a change of heart maybe from previous generations, never forgetting that, of course, we will always have to deal with anti-Semitism.
Thanks, Leslie. Welcome back, Sergio. Some final words?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of short comments. I was particularly glad to hear Leslie Bergman stressing the fundamental role of Europe as the cradle of many Jewish ideas and movements. Again, even when it wasn't so dominant quantitatively, but in terms of the quality of the contribution, back in the Middle Ages, if you think of the names Pauline mentioned, and then during the modernization and the Zionist movement, so it cannot be undervalued. And also there was an important comment about this bipolarism. It is true that today 85% of the Jews live in the US and in Israel, but this does not mean that the remaining 15% do not have a crucial contribution to make. And what I feel is still lacking is a kind of finding the right institutional way to create a real table of discussion all across these different communities and their different positions and ideas, to create a real debate and to elaborate together really a reflection about the problems of the present and the challenges of the future. What I may say to conclude on an optimistic note on Israel's side, whereas if you remember in my kind of a map of the relative position of different contents of Jewish identity, Israel appeared quite at the center of the concern of European Jews. In Israel, a similar map puts at the center the solidarity with and concern with other Jewish communities worldwide. That is, in spite of the fact that Israelis sometimes look a little bit rough and unsensitive and self-concerned, this is not true. It is still a sense of belonging to something much wider and global that still can be the element that unifies Israel across its tensions and its differences, which are very unpleasant and very uncomplicated this time. And so again, I think that the general and final message is that we live, of course, in a time of trouble. It is not an easy time, contrary to the prediction of historians and sociologists that predicted the end of ideology, the end of history, a very boring time where everything is known and consensual and flat. Not at all. That's exactly the contrary what we see. And so Jews have to navigate a very complicated sea. But yet the spirit of mutual understanding is there. And so again, the challenge is how to channel it into appropriate action that will strengthen this feeling. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio, and thank you everyone who's participated in the last hour and a quarter. I really appreciate this. Is the latest of the EUPJ webinars. We're trying to continue them at least once a month, and they're written up in the Times of Israel. If you have ideas for guests or subjects that we should handle, please do send them to Jesse. His number, his email is up there on the screen. And I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thanks to the panelists too.